I'm going to try to redo the story of the Phillipsburg, Kansas photographs and the photographer George Locke in this format to try to make it easier for people to follow because I know it can get convoluted. However, we're going to start here with Robert Mule Locke, who was born in England in 1823. Here it says he died in Utah, but I don't think that's the case. I think he died in Kansas, and I'll explain that a little later on. So we'll go down to Robert's first wife, a woman by the name of Mary Hussey Halsey, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but she possibly died anywhere between 1857 in 1858, I'm guessing, because of a couple things. We know she was alive in 1857 because that's when George was born. Possibly she died in childbirth. I don't know for sure. However, Robert remarries in 1859, so she must have died between George's birth and his remarriage. So I put the date at 1858. I don't know when she was born. But she had 3 children, Robert William Locke, Mary Alma Locke, who went on to marry C.S. Cobb, the photographer, and George Alfred Locke. He then married Charlotte Todman, and he married her in 1859. That lets me know when the dates between his first wife's passing and his second marriage. Charlotte immigrated to the U.S. with Robert Sr. and his 3 children and 2 other children. Those were her children, so that the 3 children from his first marriage, Robert, Mary, and George, along with Robert Sr. and Charlotte's 2 children, Hannah and Samuel, immigrated in 1863 to the U.S., and they are the ones that I talked about, that they started the passage to go to Utah, and that's where Hannah died first, 9 days into the trip. They left out of Nebraska. She did not even make it out of Nebraska. 9 days later, she had died. And then 25 days after they started the trip, Samuel Locke, he died also, again in Nebraska. So they never got to Utah. The rest of the family did get to Utah, and they did have another child by the name of Ellen, who was born in 1865. However, she died in 1870. So Charlotte had no living children for much of her time in the U.S. So you see the deaths of Hannah is 1863, the death of Samuel, 1863. The arrival should be ahead of this, but I have to figure out why that's not the case. And so they lived in Ogden, Utah, and that was where I could identify them as being in the 1870 census. So somewhere after the 1870 census, Charlotte Todd dies. And so he remarries a woman by the name of Alma Allie Shepherd in 1875. And this is interesting because when I first started doing this Allie came up fairly early on, and it was perplexing to me because I thought at first it was his daughter, because she was born in 1851, and it just, I don't know how it came up, but then I ended up deleting it because it said she was born in Illinois, and I'm like, what the heck? So, come to find out, he married this woman, Alma, and she, that's not her maiden name. Shepherd is not her maiden name. To find out what her maiden name is. Okay, so they marry in 1875, and they end up having 2 children. Mabel Locke, I don't know what happened to her. I have no information on what happened to her. And a son, Benjamin Franklin Locke. You can spend a little time on Benjamin, but I don't want to spend too much time because it will detract from getting back to George, which I have some new information on. But let's take a look at Benjamin Franklin Locke, and this is a picture of him as an adult. He was born in Kansas, and so that's why I know that Robert Sr. likely did not die in Ogden, Utah. He died somewhere in Kansas. I just don't have that record. So he is Robert Jr., Mary Cobb, and George Locke's brother. Okay, so he does not have any children, and he was not married. Obviously, he wasn't married and had no children. But he ends up in 1917. He's in San Diego, California, and that's where he becomes a music teacher. There are a few other documents that I showed previously about him visiting his sister. And I'll pull this up real quick. And here he talks about he is visiting with his mother, his sister, Mrs. C.S. Cobb, for some weeks. He gave a piano prelude at the Congregational Church last Sunday evening. Mr. Locke was studying music at Leipzig, Germany when the war broke out. He is certainly a fine musician. He and his mother, Mrs. S.R. Shepherd, leave for California Wednesday after a very pleasant visit. Okay? So, it tells me a few things. One, his mother goes by Mrs. S.R. Shepherd. So, that leads me to believe that Robert Locke Sr. must have passed away, and she must have remarried, because that is not her maiden name. I don't believe it's her maiden name. I haven't found any records to contradict that, but it's one of two things. It's either her maiden name or she remarried. So we don't know that. Okay, so they both are living in California, and both of them die there and are buried there. But he went on to become a music teacher. Again, no children. Okay, so let's go back to George. Well, let's do Mary a little bit. Let's start with Robert. Going all over the place. So Robert, there was not a lot of information on Robert. However, I do know that he did, in fact, marry in, he married in, let's see, 1890. Okay, he married in 1890, and there was an announcement stating that he was married in the home of his sister, in 1890, and it says who he married. So this is his marriage announcement. Okay. However, sometime later, and she came from Illinois. The woman came to Illinois to get married to him. So I don't know if it was a mail order bride situation. I'm not sure. It could be that there was some connection between Benjamin's mother, who also was born in Illinois. Maybe there was some relationship there where they connected these two. I don't know. I'm not sure. However, they did divorce probably a few years into the marriage. She went back to Illinois, and he went to Fort Morgan, Colorado, and that's where he died. Okay. So Mary Alma Locke, she married the photographer Cyprian Stephen Cobbs, also known as C.S. Cobb, and they had a son by the name of George Lincoln Cobb. And Cyprian is the one that taught George A. Locke photography. They ended up having a business together. They had at least two places that they took photographs. One was in Phillipsburg and one was in Kerwin. So here's some let's see some pictures here. Of course, this is a picture of Cyprian and Mary. This might have been earlier on. You know, he was quite a bit older than Mary. So they just had the one son, and that's George Lincoln Cobb. And she ended up moving to Fort Morgan. Everybody moved to Fort Morgan, and they did because of George Lincoln Cobb. He was a banker, George Lincoln was, and he went on to build a bank in Wiggins, Colorado. He married Jenny Cobb. They had two daughters, Alma and Verna, and Alma is the one that I spoke to, Alma's granddaughter, about the family history. So that's where I got a lot of information on the George Lincoln Cobb kind of side of the story. Also, there's a lot of pictures of both, and I'll pull those up. There's a lot of pictures of both George Lincoln Cobb, and George Lincoln Cobb obviously is named after George Alfred Locke. I think the three older siblings were pretty close. But there's a lot of pictures of both, and here's one of them. This is Benjamin Lincoln Cobb. This is Benjamin Locke. Okay. This is the baby is George Lincoln Cobb, and this is George A. Locke. So this gentleman is his uncle, but this gentleman is his brother. I know that gets complicated. The point is, there's a lot of photographs of Benjamin and George Lincoln Cobb together. A lot of pictures. And they grew up together. Even though one is an uncle, technically an uncle, they're close in age, so they kind of grew up together. Okay, so that fits in with the fact that at first I thought Benjamin must have been living with his sister because his parents died, but in fact, it was Robert Sr. and his new wife moved to Kansas as well. And that's where they all were living together. And so that's why there were a lot of pictures of them all together. So uh, Benjamin's mother was definitely in the scene when these pictures were taken. Maybe his father was deceased. I'm not sure. Okay, so we'll get to George Alfred Locke. He's the star of this story. And here he was born in 1857. And he died in 1925 in Fort Morgan, Colorado. So remember, this is the story of how they came over on a ship from England, took off probably almost immediately to go to Nebraska for 9-10 days, however long it took to get there. And then they started on the journey to Utah, which took almost 2 months, and where he saw 2 of his siblings die along the way. So, born in England, arrives here, and for a while there, he is listed in the 1870 census, so he is living in Ogden, Utah in 1870. By 1880, he is living in Kerwin, Kansas, and how he got there, I'm not sure, but that's when he was living with his sister, Mary, and his brother-in-law, C.S. Cobb. That's where he learned photography, from his brother-in-law. In 1900, he gets married to Marie Alexandra. Oh, I'm trying to think of her maiden name. I'll have to look up her maiden name. And they are living in Phillipsburg, Kansas. Here he operates a gallery during a jubilee. And he has a daughter, Gwendolyn Lorraine Locke, in 1906. Another daughter in 1910. That's Dorothea. She went by Dorothy. Gwendolyn Lorraine, she went by Lorraine. But by 1920, they were divorced. And I kind of had a hard time finding out what happened to him. I eventually found out what happened to him. He moved to Kerwin, and he was in Kerwin in 1920 census. His ex-wife, was still residing in their home in Phillipsburg, Kansas. He died. This says he died in Fort Morgan, Colorado. I'm pretty sure that's correct. He died in Fort Morgan, Colorado. Also, his brother Robert died there, and his sister Mary died there, although she had her body returned to Kansas to be interned with her husband, C.S. Cobb. So, I knew what happened to Dorothy. She moved out to California. She was a nurse, never married, and she died out in California. I believe Marie had an uncle out there, and I don't know if that's what... No, Marie had a brother out there, and I don't know if that's what brought Dorothy out to California, but nevertheless, that's where she ended up. I did not know what happened to Gwendolyn until recently, because my followers are just so good. They are just super sleuths on this stuff. And I kind of got stuck on what happened to Gwendolyn, because I didn't know if she had any descendants or not. And so this woman by the name of Jessica Ferguson, she's the one that turned me on to what happened to Gwendolyn. Because I knew she married. And the reason I knew she married is because when her mother was hit by a vehicle and killed by a vehicle, Lorraine was with her mother and her husband. The only problem for me was it was listed as she was Mrs. H.M. Sullivan, and that didn't tell me a lot. However, Jessica found out that who she was married to was a gentleman by the name of Harvey Mitchell Sullivan. That's her spouse, and she did have a son by the name of Michael Joseph Sullivan. And as of 2019, Michael and his wife Clara were on Facebook, but I haven't been able to find out anything more on that. So now we do know that Gwendolyn did have a child. She had a son. We know the name of her husband, and so that's progress. So I hope showing this in this fashion kind of, let's see, helps explain things a little bit better. And let me try to get into a tree view here. Okay. So here, zoom in a little bit. Here you have the parents. Here's Robert Mule Locke. That's the first person in our series. I don't know why I don't have Charlotte linked here, but his first wife was Mary, his second wife was Charlotte, and his third wife was Alma or Allie. Okay, and then you have the three older children. These are the three older children. And Mary marries C.S. Cobb. Robert marries Tennessee Hilton for a period of time. George marries Marie Locke. And they have the two daughters. Dorothy, as I mentioned, did not have children. However, Gwendolyn did have a son and married a woman by the name of Mary Clarice. I think I called her Clara. I don't know if she went by Clara. In any case, that's where we kind of dead end a little bit, but I think I'm pretty pleased we've got this far because this was a little hard to explain. I'll just, let's see if we can pull up. Okay, this is the other part. This is Mary. She married C.S. Cobb, the photographer. Again, he's the one that introduced George to photography, and Mary and Robert, actually. And they had the son, George Lincoln Cobb, who was married to Jenny. So I hope this explains this a little bit better. I know it's long, but trying to make it more logical and sensible or sensical. In any case, that's all I have.